Please be seated. Good morning. Last week, Father Jonathan reminded us of the existence of the Revised Common Lectionary, the order of Hebrew scriptures, including the Psalms and the Epistle and the Gospel readings appointed for our use in worship each Sunday. I had also planned on talking a little bit about our inherited sacred texts because, as worship leaders, we often receive comments about the music or our sermons or the readings each week. It's usually helpful and we're always happy to get them. They're sometimes checking a source mentioned or asking for further clarity. But a higher number than usual have reached out to us recently questioning the readings, particularly the story of David that we have been wandering through over the summer. Once the darling shepherd boy and celebrated musician, and then the heroic killer of the giant Goliath, followed by becoming the king's favorite, then less favorite, then a fugitive. By the time he's anointed king, after making payment for his first wife in a way I will not describe, risking further texts and emails, but feel free to look it up. But by then we see the power that has corrupted our young hero. A certain relative of mine who joins us online was among those who asked about the Bathsheba incident. They asked, what kind of a story is that to read in church? And my smarty pants response, to him at least, was that David's epic story contains one of the many examples of what the actual biblical standard of marriage is, and it's one I do not recommend anyone follow. Our beloved David goes on to serve as king until he is 70 years old, making many questionable choices along the way, yet honored in prophetic literature, considered an ideal king, the forefather of a future Messiah, and many psalms are ascribed to him as outpourings of his faithfulness. But you wouldn't know any of that from today's reading. Our mistake with the lectionary sometimes is that we break the stories apart. So David's story is broken into several small acts. So the arc of his life, the triumphs, failures, and redemption of this amazing, broken, yet faithful man all fall into the cracks of the weeks and days between our telling of the story. Miss a Sunday or read a scene on its own, and you're not going to understand why this is being read. Like the bit we read about David this morning. It's important, but you need to know the history of Israel and who the Cushites are to fully understand why. The same might be said about the scene from the life of Jesus in today's reading from John's Gospel. In the Gospels of Luke, Matthew, and Thomas, Jesus is very clear that all who long for God, all who seek God, can find God with no need for mediation. And Jesus strongly rebukes anyone who says otherwise. But here he says you have to go through him. Also, Jesus refers to the sacrament of bread and wine before it is instituted, and he sets more people grumbling about his claims to be like God. In his series of I am statements, echoing Yahweh's same words in the book of Exodus. And they doubt him, reminding everyone listening that they all know who Jesus' parents are and wondering what he's playing at. So if this is the small bit you learn about Jesus' story, you will clearly miss the larger narrative arc, the birth, the teachings, the miracles, challenges to authority that were taken seriously, lives made whole, and his eventual betrayal and death. Again, the lectionary is breaking apart the story into bits which depend on the larger context for clarity. St. Paul's recently hosted a book group where we discussed the novel The Midnight Library. It's a clever story that explored the question of reworking our stories so they might have different outcomes. The main character in the novel was unable to observe her larger narrative. Telling her story, she had broken it up into small acts, revisiting regrets, mistakes, and great love lost. She couldn't stop focusing on all of the times she got it wrong. And when we do that to ourselves, we can easily fall into the same trap of missing the complicated yet more complete stories of us. Our story arcs are also full of little chapters and asides we sometimes wish weren't there, but we find difficult to let go. And moments we wish there were more of, but easily forget in the rushing ahead of our lives. In truth, most weeks are okay. We end up batting 500, which I always say in baseball and I think in life is pretty good, getting it right half of the time. So the more you try to get it right, the more chances you have to do so. We find that about half of the good works and kind words and unselfish acts we attempt, we actually pull off. We can come hear these stories and feel with some confidence that at least this week we were among the faithful disciples. Or we come in after a week of COVID fog and exhaustion, difficult news, or just fatigue from the daily round, and we are sheep, happy to hear and follow our shepherd's voice. And some Sundays we walk through the doors knowing that this week we were the wolves. But when we stand back and look at the arc of our lives, the many, many times we took a hard run at faithfulness, we're okay. So we find ourselves here on our knees, not just in confession, but with thanksgiving for God's great goodness and a desire to be a part of it more and more. When we are reminded that our spiritual ancestors had roughly the same averages, we are more likely to consider the possibility that each one of our unique lives carry with them opportunities to worship God and proclaim the gospel, even and especially when they feel, from the inside anyway, flawed, with too many broken parts. But our larger stories paint a different picture. I attended a conference in Houston a few years back, navigating their brilliant underground walking paths, which are air-conditioned to beat the heat. And when I came above ground and approached the worship space for the evening service, there was a woman standing outside. She was summoning people into the service, calling them from the streets and tunnels and buses and the one cab they have in Houston. She was chanting a simple tune of welcome, and it stopped me in my tracks. It haunted me during the whole service. She seemed to be singing directly into my fear that being broken or afraid would prevent me from ever being whole. It went a little something like this. Come, come, whoever you are, weary wanderers, lovers of leaving, though you have broken your vows 1,000 times, come, 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 whoever you are, weary wanderers, lovers of leaving, though you have broken your vows 1,000 times, come, come, come. I thought of it last week when we were welcoming Olivia and her sister a bit closer into this family of God through baptism. We stood with them, companions, in this very beginning of their stories, which have lots and lots of little and big moments in them yet to come. With them, we all made our vows to seek and serve Christ in all persons, to strive for peace and justice, to continue in the apostles' fellowship, to resist evil, to proclaim the gospel. Yes, yes, we will, we will. We will with God's help. And we do. And we don't. As I renewed those vows last week, it occurred to me that I would probably break at least half of them before I got to my car that morning. But that's the point of these stories, of our telling and retelling them, because we need to be reminded over and over again that we are not our mistakes. We are not what has happened to us. We are beloved children of God whose work is to walk boldly into these lives, these deserts, these empires and stories, and to be faithful, to try time and again until we get it right. Come, come, whoever you are, weary travelers, lovers of leaving, though you have broken your vows 1,000 times, come, come, come.